Thank you for joining with me. I also want to thank the Theosophical Society in America for inviting me to give this talk and share some ideas coming out of my recent book, Zen Ecology, Green and Engaged Living in Response to the Climate Crisis. I wrote the book basically to pull together some ideas, some practices, some values that I've pulled from the Buddhist tradition that can help us live in an alternative way in the face of what's confronting humanity at this moment. An alternative way, in other words, a way that's ethical, that's green, that's sustainable, as opposed to scattered and destructive. And I think many of us, myself included, perhaps some of you, have been looking for an alternative way of living, or at least a template, a model, some pointers for an alternative way of living. And in many ways, that's what I'm doing with this book, is offering some thoughts as I try to figure this out for myself, some pointers about how to live at this complex and difficult time, especially in response to the climate crisis. And in many ways, when we think about living ethically, living ecologically, we may slip into thinking that, yeah, to do so is something I should do. I have a sense of duty or a sense of ought. I should be a good person. But hey, if I do that, I'm going to have to sacrifice a good deal of my happiness or my comfort or my enjoyment in life. The idea that to be ecological is to not have certain experiences or possessions or food that give us pleasure. And if I really want to be ethical, I'm going to have to resign myself to being miserable and perhaps a bit lonely. But I think what the Buddhist tradition offers, and a lot of other religious traditions, is a way of being ethical and ecological that is not deprivation, is not some sort of morbid self sacrifice, but actually more fulfilling than being in the rat race, living in a very busy and scattered way, being caught up in consumerism. In other words, the Buddhist path and other paths that can support us in green living also support us in finding a kind of fulfillment that may be, in many ways, higher than material consumerist fulfillment. Now, some of you may know Buddhists have, up until now, offered certain responses to the climate crisis. In many cases, Buddhists have been offering workshops and writings and YouTube videos that focus on feelings, our eco-anxiety, our despair in the face of the climate crisis, a sense of dread. And this is important because many of us can be immobilized by those feelings, in addition to simply feeling a kind of suffering as we're caught up in that anxiety, that dread. And Buddhism can help us deal with those feelings to reduce the suffering they cause, but also to free us up to take action rather than being stuck in those feelings and immobilized. And what I'm doing in this book is trying to offer something that will complement that, that will basically stand alongside that, focusing less on feelings and more on action. And in many ways, offering something here that will maybe exist hand in hand with those other offerings focused on feelings, and in a sense say, okay, yeah, once we can work with those feelings, and thank you, various Buddhist teachers, for helping us with that, here are some resources for then taking action. Now, Buddhists have talked about taking certain kinds of action. They haven't only focused on feelings, but most of the focus has been on individual action, shifting one's lifestyle, living more simply, less harm, being more mindful, more generous. And this is perhaps not surprising because in many ways, the Buddhist path that was formed 2,500 years ago, though it was not geared toward helping people green their lifestyles, the kind of values that the Buddha lifted up in that spiritual path, values like mindfulness, simplicity, non-harming, compassion, generosity, in addition to being spiritual values that'll transform us spiritually, there are also clearly values that can support us in living a greener and more ecological lifestyle. And so many Buddhists have seen that and have worked with things like mindfulness and non-harming in relation to ecological problems. In the book, I dive into some of that material, offer some of my own ideas, but then what I try to do in the book is go one step further. And that's to think about action, not just at the level of individual lifestyle change, but action or activism at the socio-political level of structural or systemic change. Basically arguing that, yes, we can green our lifestyles, maybe eat less meat, drive electric vehicles, do all of those things, but to what extent will those things be sufficient or adequate in terms of reducing the magnitude of the climate crisis significantly? And as you may know, and this is maybe something that pertains to you as well, many people have argued that yes, those lifestyle changes are important. We all need to do our part in our daily living. But until we address issues like campaign finance, issues like the power of the fossil fuel industry, certain economic indicators like GDP, the overall economic paradigm focused on growth, until we address those larger systems or structures, we ultimately will not have any significant mitigation of the magnitude of the climate crisis. And so in the book, I'm trying to offer some Buddhist ideas about those issues as well. And because I'm focusing on action at the individual level and that larger level, the way I lay it out in the book is in a series of concentric circles, starting with one's individual life, moving to one's home, then to one's home embedded in nature, one living in community with other than human animals and other humans, and then out of that community, especially with other humans, engaging in collective action, engaging in activism. And so the book sort of moves through a series of concentric circles. And as I say at one point, what I'm offering, and this is something I'm trying to figure out for myself and practice for myself, is a way of living that is spacious, that is simple, that is in the home, embedded in nature, in community, and engaged. Engaged in the sense of engaging these larger structural issues and engaging in activism. And so in many respects, that is what I'm trying to do in the book, is move through these concentric circles to think about a way of living, not just at the level of lifestyle, but our societal living and action in society that will help us address things like the climate crisis, live ethically, live ecologically, and as I said earlier, be able to do that in a way that features fulfillment, not miserable deprivation. So let me turn to a PowerPoint now, and we can walk through these different stages of the book, and I can share some of the ideas I'm conveying in the book. And hopefully what I'm about to offer to all of you and what I offer in the book will serve you in your own attempt to live ethically at this moment, and if possible, do that in a way that is fulfilling, not miserable. So again, the title of the book is Zen Ecology, subtitled Green and Engaged Living in Response to the Climate Crisis. And by green living, again, I'm thinking about individual lifestyle change, and engaged living, I'm thinking about activism directed at the macro level towards structural change. Up until now, when Buddhists have addressed environmental issues, more often than not, they look at consumerism. Again, as I mentioned a minute ago, this is kind of low-hanging fruit. If you think about consumerism as people getting caught up in certain desires, trying to build up some sort of self and self-presentation as this or that kind of person, as conveyed by one's possessions, one's clothing, one's car, whatever that might be, that's very much what Buddhism as a religious tradition has been addressing for 2,500 years. Personal desire as part of the self-attachment, attachment to one's possessions, that, as you may know, Buddhism sees as getting us into trouble. And so insofar as Buddhists have looked at consumerism as this sort of low-hanging fruit, many of the publications early on in the past 25 years, starting around the year 2000, have focused on consumerism. And I'm just sharing here in this slide two anthologies you may find interesting that are focused on Buddhism and consumerism, and by extension, how certain patterns in consumerism, buying stuff we don't need, throwing it away, the different environmental costs of producing and shipping certain goods have an ecological impact. And so often it's been consumerism that's the segue, the entree that Buddhists follow to get into environmental issues. And in many ways, in my teaching with my undergraduates, we often spend some time saying, okay, first of all, what do we really mean by consumerism? And where do we see it on campus? Where do we see it in our own lives? And this is just a working definition I offer in the book. And insofar as consumerism is an ism, it'll imply a set of ideas like socialism or communism, capitalism, but also a set of actions or behaviors. And so I'll just share this. I won't read this, but basically, if we think of consumerism as a certain belief about possessions and experiences and the actions built on that, we can start talking about this problem and its environmental repercussions. And if we think about consumerism, like I have it here, as a kind of belief that having more stuff or having certain possessions will make you happy, and certain behaviors based on that, like retail therapy when we're depressed, or buying things to display a certain self image. When you think about it, what's operating here, and this is where Buddhists zero right in, is a certain kind of desire or greed. And when Buddhism talks about desire, not just in terms of consumerism, but as a cause of human suffering, they're thinking of desire or greed as a craving for things or situations or people we don't have. That sense that if only I had that kind of car, then I'd be happy. And also clinging to things, situations, people, relationships that we do have. And that's where, as you know, Buddhism often talks about attachment, that clinging to certain things that make our scared little egos feel more secure in this wild world we live in. And in many ways, like I say here at the bottom of the slide, desire is central to the Buddhist analysis of the cause of suffering. And this is obviously one thing that connects Buddhist analyses to consumerism and its ecological impact. But when I think about it, as I was working on the book, yeah, most of us don't necessarily believe that having more stuff or having a certain set of possessions or experiences are the key to happiness. And many of us are not caught up in full-blown consumerist behaviors, rushing out to get the newest iPhone, think it'll increase my happiness or it's the key to happiness. However, many of us do have a fear, I would say, of having less as opposed to an active desire for more. In other words, a lot of us in this society, even if we're not, believing that stuff will make us happy or seeking the newest iPhone every time it comes out, we're not caught up in consumerism as that sort of desire. What we may be caught up in, however, is a certain attachment or comfort level in a way of living that does have a large ecological impact. And so maybe the bigger issue is not so much, craving for more and more stuff, but clinging to the possessions, the way of life, the situation we do have, having air conditioning, certain food we can eat, access to drive wherever we want to or go on vacation. In other words, the issue may not be so much consumerism, always wanting more and more or craving certain possessions, but materialism in the sense of being attached to certain material conditions, having that big screen TV, a certain level of air conditioning, certain food on your plate, the ability to buy certain things, do certain things, including travel. And so, one thing that I address early on in the book is materialism more than consumerism in the average, and I'm mainly focused on the United States, so it's not limited to the US, but materialism in sort of the typical, let's just say, middle class and above American lifestyle and its environmental impact, and looking at that as one cause of the climate crisis. And another thing that came to me when I think about Buddhism and resources for addressing the climate crisis and other environmental issues, in addition to the Buddhist criticism of desire and how that may help us think about our high impact materialistic lifestyle, as you probably know, Buddhism also looks a lot at attention, our scatteredness, our lack of attention. And so, another issue that Buddhism really offers some good resources to address is what I call Freneticism. And as one part of that, being always busy, maybe multitasking, scurrying, being overextended, in many ways comes down to being distracted. And thinking about freneticism and distraction, as I say here, as a hindrance to responding to the climate crisis. So materialism as one cause, so surely not the only cause of the climate crisis, and our freneticism and distraction as a hindrance to responding to it. And as I look at in the book and often talk about with my students, our distraction is often exacerbated by certain ways of using technology, whether it's getting all caught up in social media or constantly streaming reels on Instagram or whatever sort of behaviors. And distraction is, you might say, one form of ignorance, or if we drop in a hyphen here, like I did in this slide, ignorance. And as you may know, ignorance is also central to the Buddhist analysis of the cause of suffering. If you say, why might people be caught up in desire and the kind of selfishness that that entails, wanting to acquire possessions, maybe build up the sense of self? Buddhism says what's coupled there with that desire is ignorance, ignorance of impermanence, not realizing that those things we're craving or attached to will change. And in terms of things we're attached to, when they do change, to the extent to which we're attached to them is the extent to which we'll suffer. And this gets us right at the Buddhist core focus on the cause of suffering as desire. And why is desire and attachment bad? What Buddhism would say is it's bad because the objects of attachment will change. And when they do slip through your fingers, ouch, you will suffer. And so part of the cause of suffering is not just our desire, but Buddhism argues another component is our ignorance of the fact that things are changing, as well as ignorance of what we really are. Buddhism criticizing the sense that we're this separate little entity that should have certain interests that are basically, lifted up, promoted as we build up our ego, build up our possessions, in a sense, build castle walls around our insecure ego. And ignorance is also brought into play in terms of ignorance of what ultimately fulfills us. And Buddhism saying, yes, it's not found in acquiring things, building up those castle walls. And in many ways, the central notion of ignorance in Buddhism is ignorance of impermanence. But when we think about ignorance or of ignorance in relation to the climate crisis, we can kind of play with this Buddhist concept. And this is one thing I do early on in the book, thinking about ignorance and ignorance in relation to the climate crisis. And in some cases, it's total lack of knowledge, that kind of ignorance. People just don't know what's happening. Or in some cases, it may be people being misinformed, not realizing that humans play a role in causing the climate crisis and seeing it as something that comes around every 30,000 years or whatever. Ignorance or ignorance, again, in terms of being distracted. In some cases, people ignoring the problem. I don't want to look at it. I'm focused on other things. In some cases, it can be ignorance of our causal responsibility. Some of us might say, I'm not driving a gas guzzler. I'm off the hook, though we're not really looking at the food we're eating, the traveling we're doing, and other actions that result in a large carbon footprint. We may blame it on other people, the people who drive the gas guzzlers. Sometimes it's ignorance of actions we can take. That sense of what can I do? I'm just, this one lowly person. I'm not the president of the United States or the president of ExxonMobil or a congressperson. And we'll get back to this a little bit later in a little while here. Sometimes, ignorance in the form of ideas that justify continuing our destructive lifestyle. Maybe it's a sense that the end is near. History will be ending soon, whether it's the second coming of Christ or some other apocalyptic event. So why worry about some kind of long-term sustainability? The end's going to be happening soon anyway. Sometimes the ignorance takes the form of ideas about certain others, blaming other countries for causing the crisis rather than really seeing that no, we're the ones who are most responsible. And then one last thing, and I'll circle back to this a little later, ignorance in the sense of being oblivious to how embedded in nature we are, how interconnected we are with natural processes, and how much we depend on those processes. So again, part early on in the book, I'm looking at materialism as one cause of the climate crisis and what Buddhism might say about that materialism. And then our freneticism or our ignorance as a hindrance to responding to the crisis. And so basically, yeah, it's not rocket science. If we are multitasking, scurrying, constantly distracted, yeah, you don't have to be the Buddha or some wise sage to realize we need to slow down and pay more attention. And in terms of our lifestyle, yeah, what do we need to do to simplify and green our lifestyle? And so Buddhism can help us analyze materialism as a cause of the problem, freneticism as a hindrance to responding to the problem. But what can Buddhism really offer us in terms of giving us some guidelines or pointers about how to pay attention, how to simplify and green our lifestyle? One thing I do as I start working on this is in terms of the freneticism and distraction, and we'll circle back to the materialism in a minute here, this need to slow down and pay attention. One concept I work with a lot in the book is what I call spaciousness. And spaciousness is something that plays itself out in all modes of action. And Buddhism talks about three arenas of action, of karma. Basically, as you may know, karma means action. And then by extension, cause and effect, that which goes around comes around, those more popular notions of karma. But karma or action can be mental activity, what's going on in our head, verbal activity with our mouth, speaking, or physical actions, punching someone or hugging someone. And Buddhism looks at these three arenas, our mind, our mouth, and our body, as the three loci, the three locations of action. And in many cases, Buddhism is trying to work with us and those three arenas of action as we try to restrain ourselves, shift our behaviors in a spiritually transformative way. And so, for example, we can see these three arenas of action in what is here as a list of the 10 detrimental actions. Like other religious traditions, Buddhism has a lot of lists of vices and virtues, or positive virtues versus positive actions, negative vices and the negative actions they result in. And so Buddhism will often talk about 10 detrimental in the sense of messing up our spiritual growth, these 10 detrimental actions. And so some of them are physical, killing, stealing, sexual misconduct. Some of them are verbal, again, verbal actions that do not support oneself or others on the path, do not lead to a reduction of suffering, like lying, slandering people, harsh or hurtful speech, like calling people names, and frivolous speech. And then mental activity, coveting certain things. That's that desire thing we were talking about, giving way to anger or holding false views, that ignorance we were talking about a minute ago. And so in many ways, yeah, Buddhism is looking at spaciousness in these three arenas of action. And in the book, I start with mental spaciousness, looking at what Buddhism might offer to help us slow down, pay attention, be more present, and be able in that way to have the resilience and the focus to hang in there and address large systemic issues like the climate crisis. And I don't know how familiar you are with Buddhist meditation or other contemplative traditions, but in many ways, the Buddhist meditative path involves, as I say here in this slide, settling down into the breath, shifting from thinking, obsessing about things, and worrying about things to a kind of calm awareness. And Buddhism often talks about this as opening up sky mind, a calmer, deeper awareness that will observe thoughts arising, continuing, and passing, noticing how we might worry about something and then our attention shifts to something else. Not unlike how clouds appear in the sky, pass through the sky for however many moments, and then disappear. So Buddhism plays a lot with this metaphor of an open sky mind, a kind of mental spaciousness that holds thoughts, as opposed to us being just caught up in the train of thought, caught up in the obsessing. It gives us kind of a mental basket to hold that and observe that. And so here I have a quotation from Jack Kornfield, a well-known meditation teacher, where the Buddha is playing with this idea of making your mind like a vast sky. Another key figure in a lot of this is a 13th century Japanese Zen figure you may be familiar with, Dogen. And one of his famous statements, as you'll see here, is to study the Buddha way, to study and practice the teachings of the Buddha, is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self, and to forget the self is to be realized by the myriad things. And what he's saying here is basically the path is letting go of that thinking and obsessing, the mind that's always thinking about things, worrying about things, trying to calm that down, to empty the mind, to forget that self. And out of that calm, emptied, spacious awareness, then you can take things in. You can fully experience what someone is saying, fully experience maybe the sunset, some beautiful music. Chozen Bays, who is a contemporary Zen teacher in Oregon, puts it this way: we teach the mind to empty itself, and this is what Dogen means about forgetting the self, and stand ready, alert but relaxed, waiting for whatever will appear next. In other words, what we are talking about here as a kind of foundation, this mental spaciousness, is waking up as a mind that is emptied, spacious, and like the sky. And you'll see here, I'm giving you the Sino-Japanese character in parentheses. And in Japanese, it's interesting. They use one Chinese character to convey emptiness, space, and the sky. You'll see here, I'm giving you the pronunciation. When this character means empty, it's pronounced kara. When it's referring to space, it's pronounced ku. And the term for the sky in Japanese is sora. But it's interesting to me that there's one and the same character that conveys empty, space, or spacious, and the sky. And so what I'm playing with in the book in many ways is this kind of mental spaciousness. Another Zen concept I'm working with here, and this also comes from Dogen, is what's called presencing. And I'm giving you the Chinese characters here, Japanese characters, Genjo. And this is the Buddhist idea that in many cases, what we're doing in practice, like we just saw a minute ago, slowing down, working with the breath, calming the mind down, sort of emptying out the mind, opening it up as a spacious sky-like awareness, is becoming more present, is being present in the present with a kind of presence. And what's interesting, what Zen talks about is when we are fully present in that emptied out, open awareness of sky mind, we can be more able to experience things as they presence themselves to us. As you may know, Buddhism talks a lot about suchness or thusness or thisness. And this is often the kind of mental state, and maybe you've experienced this when on vacation, sitting on a beautiful beach, listening to music. Sometimes when we are calm and settled, we are able to be filled by that beauty of the sunset or the sights and smells of a summer beach, or some gorgeous music we're hearing through our earbuds or live in concert. And with this emptied out awareness, in a sense, we're filled by things. And this is what Dogen's talking about in terms of being confirmed by the many things. We're filled by them. And what Zen talks about is when we're fully present, we can feel things presencing or presenting themselves to us. And at the deepest level of that, that sense of me versus the music, me versus the sunset drops off. And what we have is just boom, the sunset, boom, the music, without any felt sense of separation, without that dualism in our normal way of experiencing that sense of me here and the sunset over there, me here and the music over there. And in that moment, it's just reality happening, reality presencing. Like I say, that sense of just this, reality happening, and there's no sense of being apart from that. Obviously, this is what people sometimes talk about in using popular language, becoming one with reality. Or the way I'd like to express it is those moments where there's no felt sense of separation. It's just this event happening, reality presenting or presencing itself without me thinking about it. And so basically, this offers a kind of resource when we think about the climate crisis. These meditative practices of Buddhism, these mental states that can be cultivated through those practices, helping us stay calmly present and face the climate crisis without panicking, without looking away, and in that way, maintain a kind of focus and resilience. And so, in terms of the three areas of action we mentioned earlier, we have the mental spaciousness in our mind, what I was just talking about. And then in the book, I talk about spaciousness in our verbal action, our mouth karma, as well as physical spaciousness, our surrounding our body, and also spaciousness in terms of time, temporal spaciousness. And I won't get into this now, but in the book, I talk about, the importance of being a good listener. So often we talk about eloquence as opposed to being a good, deep listener. And in that way, being able to truly hear, not only listen, but also hear across divides, to find common ground, to build solidarity and community, and not succumb to the idea that, we Democrats are different from Republicans, or those of us who live in a red state cannot see eye to eye with people in a blue state. As many of you may know, there's a lot more common interest and commonality across those boundaries than certain people want to acknowledge, who may benefit from dividing us. Also, in terms of physical spaciousness, offering a few practices, a few pointers about, how can we declutter our schedule and not be constantly multitasking? Now, granted, some of us do have to work several jobs and scurry just to get food on the table or avoid getting evicted. But many of us, in many cases, are overextended, do have too much in our schedule, are scurrying and scattered and multitasking. And our living spaces, our glove compartments in our car, the tops of our desks at work, are often highly cluttered. And so, in part, what I'm doing in the book is saying, again, it's maybe a kind of foundation for addressing the climate crisis. How can we declutter our space, declutter our calendar, and open up time and space to be able to pay greater attention and possibly get engaged? And so, in any case, what I'm doing early on in the book is talking about spaciousness in these three areas of action as a response to freneticism and distraction, helping us slow down, declutter, and pay attention. And when it comes to our materialistic lifestyle, as I said a minute ago, Buddhism does offer some very good resources there. In many ways, Buddhism offers what you could call an environmental virtue ethic. As I said earlier, the Buddha lifted up a number of values or virtues that he saw as spiritually transformative, that helped us deal with our desire, our self-attachment, our ignorance, and liberate us spiritually. And a lot of these you may be familiar with, especially mindfulness, but also things like restraint, simplicity, contentment, other things I have on this little list here. And again, 2,500 years ago, the Buddha lifted these up to help us overcome the suffering that's caused by our desire and our ignorance. But obviously, if we look at these, they also offer resources for thinking about a different way of living, a more green way of living. So at one point in the book, I devote a chapter to looking at these traditional Buddhist values and working with them, not just as practices on a spiritual path, but as resources for thinking about how to green our lifestyle. And again, do it in a way that's not deprivation, not some sense of I have to sacrifice my own comfort, my own pleasure if I want to be a good person, but with this Buddhist angle. And you can find this in other traditions. It's not just Buddhism, but with this Buddhist angle, with these values, this simple green living, in many ways, being more rewarding and more fulfilling than being caught up in the rat race or constantly working to get more money, to get more things, to get more status, to get more prestige. And so, for lack of a better expression, yes, I'm articulating what you might call an environmental virtue ethic. And to help us with that, a lot of us might think, okay, I should be more generous. I should be more mindful. Let me be, less harming. Maybe I should have less meat in my diet. And as we all know, even if we lift up those values and say to ourselves, I should be more generous, I should be more mindful, I should do less harm, often it's tricky to do that without certain support structures. If we're a traditional monastic, yeah, we're right there in the monastery. Our possessions are limited. We're bought into and fully involved in a lifestyle that may be vegetarian, very simple living, very low ecological impact. But for those of us who are lay people and not living in monasteries, yeah, how might we put these ecological values like restraint and generosity, mindfulness into practice in our own lives, in our own homes? And so I devote one chapter to thinking about how we might live life in our homes as what I'm calling a kind of home monastery. So we can create these support structures that will help us put into practice in our lifestyle these values like restraint and generosity. And so I talk about certain vows, certain mantras that may sound kind of far out, but by that I'm just thinking about reminders, things to keep in mind, certain little rituals and other practices around the home, and how we can take Zen monasticism with its simple living, with its closeness to nature, with its rejection of excess possessions, with that very simple, green, fulfilling lifestyle as a kind of model or template for living this way in our own homes, even if we're not a monastic. Moving out through concentric circles, as I said earlier, okay, starting with ourselves, how can I be more spacious in my thinking or my mind, my speech, my action? How might I think about certain values in my home, in my daily life to reduce my impact? How might I have my home with those support structures to help me pursue these values? And then going out one more concentric circle, beyond self, beyond home, to think about one's place and thinking about how Buddhism may offer resources for helping us to live fully embedded in nature in one's place. And one form of ignorance, as I mentioned earlier, is ignorance of our embeddedness in nature, our dependence on nature, ignorance taking the form of that sense of being separate from the natural world. And Buddhism, especially the Zen tradition, can offer resources to help us be more aware of our interconnectedness with things around us, our indebtedness to natural processes, can help us realize our embeddedness. And I'm using realize in two senses in the book. Realize in the sense of wake up to really get something in our head, but also realize in the sense of actualize. Like when someone realizes their aspirations, they actually give them concrete form. They actually secure those conditions in actuality. So I'm playing with realize in two senses there. And also Buddhism helping us not only appreciate the natural world, but value it and care about it and care for it. And so in that chapter, I'm talking a lot about starting off talking about nature in Zen aesthetics, painting, gardens, the tea ceremony, and how certain Zen practices help us overcome that felt sense of separation. In many ways, Zen meditation is all about getting out of our heads, getting out of that dualistic mode of experiencing. Here's me, there's the object of experience over there, and achieving that open sky mind where the separation drops away and we are filled by what we are experiencing. There's that intimacy, or if you will, that oneness with things around us. And obviously, in many ways, you could argue that one of the problems around environmental issues is not just people being, frenetic all the time, not just our lifestyle with a large ecological impact, but people failing to feel that intimacy with nature, failing to realize how we are embedded in nature, interconnected with it, even when we're sitting inside at our desk. And out of that awareness, if we can achieve it, a greater sense of intimacy, a greater knowledge of nature, a realization that, yeah, if I harm nature, I'm harming myself. And out of all of that, greater care for nature and also caring in the sense of taking care of nature, not just caring about nature. One thing I talk about in the book, and I'll just be very brief here, in terms of humans and nature, is the whole question of animals. As you know, often we talk about environmental ethics, we get into questions like eating. Should we be vegetarian or better yet, vegan? How should we treat animals? Animals in research for cosmetics or medical cures. And suffice it to say, I do spend a chapter looking at Buddhism and animals. And in many ways, it's a mixed bag. You might think that the Buddhist concern about suffering and Buddhist compassion would have Buddhism be a very pro animal religion. Insofar as animals can feel pain, they can suffer. They're sentient beings as well as human beings are sentient beings. But historically, it's been a mixed bag. Even though, like I was just saying, Buddhism will see animals as also able to suffer, which might make you think that Buddhists would really give them moral regard and try to reduce their suffering. In other cases, yeah, Buddhists are not necessarily vegetarian. In many cases, animals are seen as inferior to humans. Buddhists saying animals can't achieve the wisdom that meditation is trying to cultivate, a liberating salvific wisdom. Often animals are seen as more caught up in desire, less able to restrain themselves, less able in that respect to cultivate some of these Buddhist values like contentment, restraint, non harming. And one thing I have found interesting in terms of trying to develop Buddhist thought about animals, historically, Buddhism really hasn't spent much time talking about the exact nature of animal sentience. To the tradition's credit, there's a concern about animals as other creatures, other sentient beings who can suffer, but very little attention to the nature of animal suffering or degrees of animal suffering. Is the suffering of a chimpanzee the same as the suffering of a cockroach? Or in making decisions, how can we distinguish a chimpanzee from a mosquito and have that distinction inform our action, whether it's about medical research or swatting a bug on your arm on a balmy summer evening? Buddhism hasn't really gotten in there and really thought about what exactly is going on in animal consciousness and how that may relate to the exact nature of animal suffering. And out of that kind of inquiry, becoming more able as a religion to think long and hard about how we should treat animals, if and when we can morally eat them or not, or use them in research, or just raise them as pets. I mean, all of these issues that often come up in animal rights debates or animal welfare discussions. And so I do spend some time looking at that. And I found, and I won't talk about this, you can find this in the book, but when I was working on the book, I circled back to David Abram's writings. And I don't know if you're aware of Abram, but he's talked a lot in his writings about animal sentience, and not just animal sentience involving the ability to feel pain, but how a lot of indigenous traditions, or he often refers to them as oral traditions, are very attuned to, for example, not just animals' ability to experience pain, but their expressiveness, how they communicate, the subtleties of animal behavior, animal communities, animal societies, if you will. And then, yes, in some cases, full blown shamanism, certain indigenous people having an ability to tune into animal awareness, communicate, pick up on certain very subtle signals. And in many ways, I think Buddhism can learn from David Abram and indigenous traditions. And this is one thing I'm saying in the book, to develop their understanding of animals, the exact nature of what's going on with animals of different species, perhaps along a spectrum, and thereby become more nuanced in the treatment of animals around issues like research, harm, habitat, zoos, and all of these other issues that often come up. And so I'm playing with that a little, and also saying that insofar as Buddhists can get a better understanding of animals, their communication, their sentience, their societies, how that may support Buddhists in their compassion for other than human animals when it comes to things like the climate crisis. As many of you know, when we have a major flood, a major wildfire, perhaps other cataclysmic events that may directly or indirectly be caused by global warming, we often get a lot of data on property loss or the loss of human life. We do not get data, for example, with the large forest fires in recent years in Canada. We don't get data about how many owls, how many elk, how many bear, how many fish in the streams are getting harmed or dying in those events. And in many ways, at least when I focus on Buddhism, yeah, I think Buddhists can learn from some of these other traditions, especially indigenous traditions, and in that sense, become more savvy about animals and expand and deepen Buddhist compassion, maybe as another way to get Buddhists mobilized, concerned about the climate crisis, not just the harms to human and our economies, but also harm to other than human relatives, to use an indigenous term. And basically, yeah, what some people have argued is maybe what we need to do to really be attuned to the climate crisis, to keep our eye on the ball, is not just be intimate with nature in certain moments, like peak experiences when we're out hiking, or developing greater kinship with animals, but maybe what we also need to do is to have an ongoing connection to nature in our place. And here in the book, I pull a lot from Gary Snyder, the Pulitzer Prize winning poet, who, in addition to writing poetry, as you may know, has written a number of prose essays, including one called Re-inhabitation, where he's talking about the need to re-inhabit one's place, really learn one's local place, the geology, the hydrological cycle, how water moves through one's neighborhood, one's place, in a watershed, in a bioregion. And basically, Snyder argues that by really knowing our place, committing to a place over the long haul, and joining with others in community with other than human animals that happen to live in our place, and in community with other human beings. And so I devote a chapter to thinking about community, both as in the ways that Snyder talks about it in Re-inhabitation, and Bill McKibben's talked about it in books like Earth and Deep Economy, and the importance of building community in terms of resilience, adapting to the climate crisis, but also in terms of mitigation. In other words, activism geared toward reducing the magnitude of the crisis, in part by reducing greenhouse gas emissions, community looming very large there in terms of people mobilizing together, and basically supporting each other through collective activism. And that brings us to sort of a turning point in the book, where, as I said early on, if we're really going to address something like the climate crisis, we have to focus not only on lifestyle change, eating less meat, driving an electric car, that's all great. But when we have a political economy, certain structures, economic models, certain ways, government policy is set, tax breaks for oil companies, lack of funding for public transportation, yeah, we can talk until we're blue in the face about lifestyle change, and that is important. We should all do what we can do. But to focus only on that is ultimately to blame the consumer, to blame individuals, and let these larger players, these larger, focal points of power, whether it's the fossil fuel industry, perhaps the US Congress, Chamber of Commerce, other things like international treaties, economic models, taking GDP as our economic indicator, these large systemic or structural dimensions of the problem can get lost in the shuffle. And so what I'm arguing here is, yes, slow down, pay attention, practice spaciousness, live a certain way in your home, put those Buddhist values into practice, connect to your place, deepen your connection to nature and other animals, build local community. And then on that basis, we also need to get involved in activism. And so one of the questions that gets into the discussion here, and this is bringing me to the end of the book and to my end of my talk here with you today, is the whole question of if we need to look at structural issues, that basically focusing just on changing my lifestyle and eating less meat is not sufficient. How equipped is traditional Buddhism to address these larger social and political economic issues? Does it offer certain historical examples or resources for speaking truth to power, for challenging the status quo, whether it's protesting or lobbying, whatever that might be? And might there be forms of activism that Buddhism might advocate that may be unique to the tradition, not standard forms of marching, protesting, lobbying, whatever that might be? Another question is, how might activism be done as a form of Buddhist practice rather than an appendage to things like meditation? Some people might say, no, if you're a Buddhist, you should be meditating and chanting and focusing on that. Marching and lobbying and protesting, that's not legitimate action. One question might be, no, maybe insofar as those activities do reduce suffering and can be done in a way that are spiritually transformative, maybe activism can be appropriated and done as a kind of Buddhist practice. And then the other question is often, how might Buddhist resources support activists? And one thing I just want to highlight, and I'm not going to go down through this, but simply put, historically, compared to other religious traditions, that prophetic voice, that speaking truth to power, that challenging of the status quo has not been a strong suit of Buddhism. And some of you who are listening to this can pause the recording and take a look at this list. It continues on another slide. But what I have here are a whole range of historical factors that have mitigated against Buddhists speaking truth to power. Simply put, through a lot of Buddhist history, Buddhism has been according with the status quo, in a sense, going with the flow rather than challenging those in power, thinking about suffering as more of an individual psychological thing and not extrapolating and thinking about larger societal suffering caused by sexism, poverty, homophobia, Islamophobia, on and on, anti-Semitism, you name it. And as I just said, maybe there's some ways that, engaging in activism can be beneficial to a Buddhist, and in many ways is not an appendage to practice, but is something that can help us, whether it's getting a better sense of ourselves when we go to protest and we're feeling nervous. We're wondering about what our neighbors would say if I put that yard sign in my front yard. In many ways, activism can, insofar as we are giving of ourselves and giving of our talents, support us in cultivating generosity and compassion, maybe community, Maybe activism helps us see interconnectedness at the macro level, not just the interconnectedness that went into the food on my plate in front of me. In many ways, maybe activism can help us overcome inertia, overcome a certain sense of despair, and gain a certain kind of active hope, to use Joanna Macy's language. In many ways, yeah, it'll help us reduce suffering and serve the common good. And just finally, I end up the book, and often I'm thinking about my students who may not be activists, who may not be involved. Are there things we can do, even in our own little way, to get more active? Most people, when they think about being an activist, they may think, oh, I have to be out there with a bullhorn or getting arrested, or again, putting my livelihood, my job at risk, or my friendships at risk if I'm outspoken. And one article I've used in my teaching, and it's there in the book, is by Emma Harris. And here's the title, How to Stop Freaking Out and Tackle Climate Change. And as you'll see, she offers a 5-part plan. And what I do in the book, kind of riffing on her 5-part plan, is yeah, one of the things she's talking about is think about what you can do. You don't have to do everything. For example, if you join up with a local environmental group, maybe there's certain things you can bring to the table. You have certain passions, certain things that bring you joy, certain skills, certain resources. And so, how might we identify what we are good at, what really excites us, and use that as an entree into thinking about, yeah, how do I get engaged? And there are so many dimensions of the climate crisis. As you know, that's one of the things that makes it so daunting. But in the book, I'm saying, yeah, there are a lot of ways you can get involved. Thinking about regenerative agriculture, working with local school kids to help them think about the carbon footprint of certain types of farming or ways of getting our food. Protecting forests as carbon sinks. As a hiker, one of the things that most interests me are forests and carbon sequestration. And so my own activism, I focus a lot on carbon storage in forests, protecting forests, and agitating to get more land put into reserves rather than public land available for logging. And then, yeah, asking ourselves, what actions are we drawn to? Are you good at social media? Maybe that's how you can contribute. Maybe you're a good artist and you can make posters. Maybe you're a good communicator. Maybe you like to organize things like a rally. And then thinking about, yeah, what group might I join? Is it something local at the state level, international? What might be your plug-in? And so basically, at the end of the book, I'm trying to offer a couple pointers to help us when we're saying to ourselves, yeah, I'll try to green my lifestyle, I'll follow some of these guidelines. But in terms of addressing these larger structural issues, what can I do? It's kind of scary. Maybe there are ways to just think about our strengths, our passions, and at least little ways to get involved in an organization, in certain actions, and maybe do that in a way that is part of our spiritual path, a way to give more to others, to express love, to express compassion, and basically, in that way, to cultivate our character, to cultivate our spirit, not just simply do a good deed. So, in any case, those are some of the things I cover in the book. Again, moving from oneself and spaciousness to one's home in nature, in community, and then in community with others, getting involved and responding to the climate crisis, not only at the individual level, but at that larger social, political, economic, that structural level. So I hope some of these comments are helpful as you figure out your own way of living at this time. In many ways, this book is my attempt to at least get down on paper some of the things I've been trying as I continue to try to figure out how to live in a way that is ethical and ecological right now and is also fulfilling as opposed to a way of life that features deprivation and being miserable. So thank you for listening to this talk. I hope if you do get the book that it is supportive of your path as we all try to figure out how to live at this very challenging time. Thank you.